Have started denying that a promise was ever given to you. You see, for many of you, you've experienced a waiting season. And I tell you, I'm not a very patient person. I do not like to wait. When Sister Jess gets me a gift, I'm like, I want it right now. And she's like, no, you have to wait till your birthday, or you have to wait till Christmas, or you have to wait till this specific date. And I was like, no, you already bought it. It's already here. It came in. I opened it. I opened the Amazon box. It's here. It's mine. I don't like waiting. And for many of you, you are probably the same way, that you hate to wait. And it's not the easiest for us to wait. And it becomes real easy to feel like God has forgotten you, or simply He doesn't care what is hurting you, what you're yearning for, what you're praying for, or what you desire for. Tonight, if you have your Bibles, we are going to be in two spots tonight. Well, we're going to be in a couple, but beginning, we're going to be in two. So I want you to first turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 3. And I'm going to read one verse, and then we're going to jump to Genesis chapter 15, starting with verse 17. In Ecclesiastes 3:1, I'm reading this in the King James Version, just this verse, because I like what it says, and I think it's very important to where we're headed this morning. In Ecclesiastes 3:1, it says, "For everything there is a season, and a time for every purpose under heaven." You see, I want to begin this evening by saying that God does not give anyone empty promises. You see, but I know that in between the Jordan and denial, it can become pretty tiresome. It can become pretty deflating. It can become pretty annoying and frustrating. Like, God, you've given me a promise, and I'm ready for it to happen right now. You see, I'm tired of being sick. I'm tired of being hurt. I'm tired of being poor. Some of you are tired of being single. But you see, it seems like God has just left you in this state of suspense. You see, when I was a little kid and I would go to Astroworld, and then we would ride this ride called the Grease Lightning. And we would get in our seats. And then the person that was in control, they would say, "Hey, is everybody ready?" And everybody would shout, "Yeah, let's go." And then nothing would happen. And then they would wait right until you let your guard down. And they would hit that button and off you went. You see, in Genesis chapter 15, we read of a promise given to Abraham to his descendants. In Genesis chapter 15, in verse 17 through 21, it says, "When the sun had set and it was dark, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch appeared and passed between the divided animals. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, I give the land to your offspring, from the brook of Egypt to the great river," that's the Nile, "the Euphrates River, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Kadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, Amorites, Canaanites, Gerishites, and the Jebusites." You see, but then Abraham's descendants, they are left in a state of suspense for more than 400 years until they begin to fully work towards their promise. In Genesis chapter 15, they receive the promise. And we don't read of any moment that puts the Israelites on the path towards their promise until Exodus chapter 14. And right from the beginning, right when they begin moving towards the promise, the Israelites have been waiting for so long that they begin denying that a promise was ever given to them. In Exodus chapter 14, verse 10 through 12, it says, "As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians coming after them. The Israelites were terrified and cried out for the Lord to help. And they said to Moses, 'Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Isn't this what we told you in Egypt? We told you to leave us alone so that we may serve the Egyptians.'" You said it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. They were saying, let's just stay in Egypt. It's better in Egypt. The Egyptians weren't all bad. You see, it's been 400 years. We don't have a promised land. Leave us alone. Let us stay. In their entire journey to the promised land, they would end up saying that they wanted to go back to Egypt 4 times. We see God here inviting his children into freedom. You see, the Israelites had not had a conversation with God for 400 years. They were born to be the children of God. They were destined to be with God, but they hadn't had a relationship with him in 400 years. You see, they had pretty much assimilated into Egypt. And here comes along Moses, and to tell the people, hey, remember the promise that God gave Abram? Well, guess what? It is time. So pack up your stuff. It's time. It's moving day. We're headed to the promised land. And immediately there are issues. As they reach the Red Sea, their first of many blockades that they would face, they see the Egyptian army running after them. And the Israelites immediately begin to deny that they ever had a promised land, that they ever had a future outside of Egypt, that they ever had a calling, that they ever had a promise. You see, we all know what happened next. Moses raises his staff, the waters part, and they walk on dry ground all across the way. But once across, the reality sets in. They had experienced abuse for 400 years, being squeezed into something that the Egyptians wanted, that they had been squeezed for so long that they had forgotten who they were and what God had promised them. You see, they had no sense of real identity. Their language was gone. Their food was gone. Their religion was pretty much all gone. And now they are in Egypt just surviving. And just like the Israelites, because you've been waiting on your promise for so long, your heart is broken. Your life has been altered. You've been disappointed. Everything that didn't turn out the way that you wanted it. And for most of you, you are just surviving. You see, how many of you have gone through a situation that you are glad that you just survived through? You see, you should give yourself a pat on the back because, yes, you're stuck in the middle, but you haven't decided to go walk back. You see, but the Israelites didn't know that before they didn't know that before they could cross the Jordan into their promise, that God would specifically call them into places on their way. You see, tonight, I believe that God wants us to know that before we can cross our Jordan, before we can receive our promise, is that he will first call us into the desert. You see, just like in our verse from Ecclesiastes, there is a purpose for every season in our lives. So when God brings you into or calls you into a season, then we as Christians must understand that there is a reason, that there is a purpose, and that that God is always going to be with us. You see, immediately after the Israelites crossed the Red Sea, God immediately calls them into what could be the worst thing possible. Exodus chapter 15 through 22 says, Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur. You see, God immediately calls them into the desert. You see, I've never been into a true desert. I've been in some pretty dry places where all there are those bushes and tumbleweeds and rocks. But I've never been in a true desert where there is absolutely nothing. You see, God called them into that type of place where there was absolutely nothing. It was a place where God had to supply everything. He supplied the water for them to drink. He supplied the manna and the quail for them to eat. But for the Israelites, the desert was the worst place, was a worse place than the place that they had left. And because the Israelites didn't understand their God and they didn't understand the purpose, the Israelites acted incorrectly. You see, what should have been only a 1-year stint ended up being a generational stint. All they saw was what they were looking at. They saw the heat. They saw the lack of resources. And you see, for many of you, when you are between the Jordan and denial, that is what you are experiencing. All you seem to be experiencing is fire and heat. And you're left with wondering what God is doing. And for most of us, wondering where God went. You see, it's not the wait, W-A-I-T, in the desert that caused people to stumble. But it is the weight, W-E-I-G-H-T, of the desert. It's the heaviness. It's the fear. It's the uncertainty. It's the not knowing or the not knowing how that comes from desert seasons. You see, how am I going to get through this? I don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. You see, Moses came into the Israelite camp and said, come on, guys. It's time to get moving. Pack up what you can and follow me. You see, for some of you, to get to your promise, you have to completely uproot some things in your life. The Israelites didn't know where they were going or what they were going to face. To them, it was supposed to be better than what they faced in Egypt. And as humans, it's the not knowing and the uncertainty that wears us out. The enemy knows that he can take you out. The enemy knows that he cannot take you out, but the enemy well knows that he will wait until you're worn out. Think about Job. He had one thing happen right after another. And as you read the story of Job, you can almost experience, as each thing happens, the more wear and tear it had on Job. That's when the devil comes in. And he says, didn't God promise that this was going to be better? Didn't God promise that you were going to get through this? Why don't you just go back to where you were from? You see, this is very important because you can't shorten a desert season, but you can definitely prolong it. What happens when believers get stuck in the desert season, what happens is that we begin to get passive aggressive. And we start to really argue with God. We really start to say, fine, you don't want to help me out? I'm in a time of need. Guess what? I don't need you. I'm going to stop praying every single day. I'm going to stop giving my tithes. I just won't obey you. You see, you might not think that out loud, but that's how you think deep down. You see, we tend to want to get a little revenge because we don't think God is moving how we think he should move. You see, no one likes the wilderness. No one longs for the wilderness. No one says, God, will you please give me trials and tribulations and tests? But as Christians, you must understand that the wilderness is the most important time of your promise. It's like that children's song. Have you ever heard that children's song, We're Going on a Bear Hunt? We're going on a bear hunt. We can't go through it, or we can't go around it. We can't go over it. We can't go under it. What do? We have to go through it. Look, there's no way around desert seasons in your life. We just can't skip desert seasons and arrive at our promise because it is our desert season that God uses to prepare and to equip us for the promise. You see, but preparation and equipping doesn't come until you are fully reliant on God, where your ability to self-provide is stripped away. You see, I mentioned earlier that the desert was a place where God supplied everything. But all the Israelites saw, they were starving, they were thirsty, and we make the Israelites seem like the bad guys, saying, didn't they know that God was right there? How dare they not be thankful for the manna and the water that they did receive? But we do the exact same thing. God, why aren't you moving in my life? God, where is this promise that you gave me so many years ago? God, where are you? And God is saying, I'm waiting for the moment where you have no choice but to rely on me. I'm waiting on you to let me take the steering wheel. But God, don't you know that I am him? I bet on me. But the reality is that there's only been one I'm him, and it's the one that said I am. The reality is that you are not that good. You are not really good on your own. All the accolades that you have received aren't really yours. The reason that you have those accolades is because God gave them to you. He gave you the ability. He gave you the knowledge. He gave you the perspective. You see, but because God is never going to give you anything that you aren't ready for. For those in the room that has gone through the desert, they can tell you that they have gained valuable lessons from their experience in the wilderness. You see, before you can cross into the Jordan, before you can receive your promise, guess what? He will call you into a desert season. But the second thing he will do is call you to a place to listen. You see, 3 months into the journey, 3 months of God providing water in different places and eating manna and quail that God provided, the Israelites come to Mount Sinai. And Moses goes up to the mountain. He has a conversation with God. God tells Moses, haven't you seen what I did to the Israelites? Didn't you see how I carried you guys on eagle's wings? Then he tells Moses to tell the people to listen carefully and to keep his covenant. And that if they did, that they would be the kingdom of priests in the holy nation. In other words, he was repeating their promise to the Israelites that he gave Abraham. He told them, hey, if you keep my covenant and follow me, guess what? You're going to be my people. You're going to be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. And so Moses goes back down. He gets all the elders together. They all agree, hey, yeah, we're going to follow what God tells us to do. We want to be that holy nation. We want to be that nation of priests. We've seen what God can do. We've seen what he did to the Egyptians. We're going to follow him. And so they all agree. And Moses goes back up the mountain to tell God that, guess what? He had a deal. In Exodus 19, chapter 19, verse 9 through 13, the Lord said to Moses, I'm going to come to you in a dense cloud, so that the people will hear when I speak to you and will always believe you. Moses reported the people's words to the Lord, and the Lord told Moses, go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow. They must wash their clothes and be prepared by the third day. For on the third day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all people. Put boundaries for the people all around the mountain and say, be careful that you do not go up on the mountain or touch its base. Anyone who touches the mountain must be put to death. No hand may touch it. Instead, he will be stoned or shot with arrows and not live. Whether animal or human, when the ram's horn sounds a long blast, then they may go up the mountain. The Israelites follow what God had told them to do. They consecrated themselves. They washed their clothes, and they waited for God to come down. The story goes on. It says, on the third day when the morning came, there was thunder and lightning, a thick cloud on the mountain, and a very loud blast from a ram's horn, so that all the people in the camp shuddered. Then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. You see, Mount Sinai was completely enveloped in smoke because the Lord came down on it and fire. Its smoke went up like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain shook violently. And as the sound of the ram's horn grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him in the thunder. Verse 20, the Lord came down on Mount Sinai at the top of the mountain. Then the Lord summoned Moses to the top of the mountain, and he went up. And the Lord directed Moses, go down and warn the people not to break through to see the Lord. Otherwise, many of them will die. Even the priests who come near the Lord must consecrate themselves, or the Lord will break out in anger against them. You see, here we see God, he understood the Israelites better than they knew themselves. In the first few verses we read, we see that God gave them very specific directions to follow. He said, hey, I want you to consecrate yourself. I want you to bathe. I want you to wash your clothes, and then meet me at the bottom of the mountain. But do not touch the mountain. Do not come near the mountain. And then we see when God finally shows up after 3 days, he has to call Moses back up the mountain to remind them of the directions, because some of the Israelites were breaking through to reach the mountain. You see, we continue to see this story of the Israelites, that their unfaithfulness is repetitive. Plain and simple, they never listened to God the first time. You see, after Moses comes down the second time and said, guys, you've heard the Lord. You can't get close to the mountain or even touch it. The Israelites hear from the Lord, and guess what? It scares them. God begins to speak what we know as the 10 Commandments. And guess what? When God begins to speak, it scares the Israelites. And because he scares the Israelites are saying, hey, we don't want God to talk to us anymore. Moses, you can talk to us. You can go talk to the Lord. But we don't want God talking directly to us. And so Moses goes back to the mountain. Later in the story, we see the Israelites get so tired of waiting for Moses that they build a golden calf to represent the new God. You see, God specifically brought them to a place for the Israelites to listen. And between your Jordan and the denial, God will bring you to a place where he wants you to listen to him. You see, the Israelites were brought into that place, but they weren't listening to God. Instead, they told Moses to listen. And they got so busy, they got so tired of waiting that they began to try to make their promise come faster on their own. You see, when God calls you to the point of listening, do not be so busy that you miss what he is saying. God is speaking. Are you listening? And so first, God, when you're on your path to your Jordan, to your promise, he will first call you into a season of the desert. Then he will call you to a point of listening. And the last thing that he will call you to do is to climb mountains. You see, if you were to look at the map of the Israelites' journey, you will notice that the journey did not get any easier after they left Mount Sinai. In fact, it might have been the hardest part of the journey. You see, in total, they had to climb 4 more mountain ranges on their way to the promised land. They climbed Mount Seir and then Mount Hermon, and then they backtracked and they climbed Mount Seir again and then Mount Paran. You see, why did God call the Israelites to climb so many mountains? I believe that the answer can be found in the Old Testament, further in the Old Testament at the beginning of the Bible in Genesis chapter 19. We all know this story. We've all heard this story of Lot's wife. And it says, at daybreak, the angels urged Lot to go on. Get up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or you will be swept away in the punishment of the city. But he hesitated. Because of the Lord's compassion for him, the man grabbed his hand, his wife's hand, and the hands of his 2 daughters, and they brought him out, and they left him outside the city. As soon as the angels got them outside, one of them said, run for your lives. Do not look back, and do not stop anywhere on the plain. Run to the mountains, or you will be swept away. But Lot said to them, no, my lords, please. Your servant has indeed found favor with you, and you have shown me great kindness by saving my life, but I cannot run to the mountains. The disaster will overtake me, and I will die. Look, there is a town close enough for me to flee to. It is a small place. Please let me run to it. It's only a small place, isn't it? So that I can survive. And the angel said to him, all right, I'll grant your request. But about this matter too, and will not demolish the town that you mentioned. Hurry up, run to it, for I cannot do anything until you get there. Therefore, the name of the city is Zoar. And the sun had risen over the land when Lot reached Zoar. Then out of the sky the Lord rained down Sodom and Gomorrah, burning sulfur from the Lord. He demolished these cities, the entire plain, and all the inhabitants of the city, and whatever grew on the ground. But Lot's wife looked back and became a pillar of salt. You see, as they exited the city, the angels gave them one instruction: to run to what? The mountains. And do not stop until you get over the mountains. They told them, do not even look back. You see, the angels knew that the destruction of the city would be too tempting to look back. That's why they told them to run and to get over the mountains. You see, once they were over the mountains, there would have been no way for them to look on the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, because the mountain would have been between them and the city. It would have been impossible to see the destruction. But when the angels tell Lot that to tell Lot to run over the mountains, he tells them that going over the mountains wasn't really what was best for him. That if he ran towards the mountains, he would surely die. And he asked to go to another city that was close enough to run to. And the angels agree. And Lot and his family run to it. And once they arrive in the city, the Lord's rained down judgment upon Sodom and Gomorrah, killing everyone inside the city. And at that time, Lot's wife looked back, and immediately she was turned into a pillar of salt. You see, I want you to understand that your journey to your Jordan is hard, and that is okay. God never wanted it to be easy for us. It has to be hard. Just taking a look at the Israelites' journey proves it. God likes us to do things the hard way. So do not get upset and discouraged if your journey has been hard. God wanted the Israelites to climb those mountains because he knew that once they were over him, they would look back and they would not be able to see Egypt any longer. That they wouldn't be able to see what had held them there for so long. You see, in all my years of climbing mountains and hills, guess what? I don't think about where I was at the bottom. I don't wish to go back to the bottom. It was the top. It was seeing what was on the other side. You see, when I look at mountains, pictures of mountains I climb, I don't think about how beautiful it was at the bottom. I think about, hey, I've climbed that mountain. I've made it to the top. You see, God has you climb mountains not because he wants you to remember the beginning or where you started, but to remember the victory. He wants us to remember that, yeah, it was hard, but God was with me every single step of the way. And I'm not going back to Egypt. I'm not going back to what was comfortable. I'm not going back to what was easy. Reaching your promise, that's what reaching your promise is all about. That when you look back to see, you see the victories that you have had through Jesus Christ. Tonight, as my wife comes to the piano, I don't know where you are in your process to gain the promise that God has given you. You could be at the very beginning in your desert season where both God and your promise seem 1,000 miles away. That everything around you has been so dry and so desolate. You are wondering why God would even bring you in a place that it seems your promise is going to die with you. You could be in a place that God has called you to listen. And you've been so busy that you haven't really been obeying. Maybe you're here tonight and you are in the middle of climbing the biggest mountain that you've ever faced. Tonight, if you've been stuck between your Jordan and denial, if you've been waiting so long that sometimes it seems that you would rather go back to the days where you didn't even know that God had a promise for you, just like the Israelites. God had promised them their own land, and He promised that He would be with them every single step of the way. But because they didn't receive their promise immediately, because they had to face the desert, because they had to climb some mountains, they said, God, just take us back. Just let us go back. Let us go back to a time before we even knew there was a promise. Let's go back to my comfortable shack. Yes, we had to work hard. Yes, I occasionally got beaten, but I wasn't starving. I wasn't running for my life. I wasn't running into giants and giant walls. I was comfortable. Maybe you're here in person or you're watching online, and you're in this journey to your Jordan, and you've been doing this. God, I want what was promised to me. Maybe you're here tonight and you're saying, man, I'm so sick of this desert. I'm sick of everything being so dry and desolate. Maybe you're here tonight and you've gone through these seasons and you're to the point where you're like, man, I just don't want my healing anymore. You know, I've been feeling great lately. I think I can manage without my healing. God, I want what you promised me. Maybe you're here tonight morning and you're like, what? I've got to listen to a test and trials. I have to I have to show my obedience and my faith. Maybe you're here and you say, I don't need that extra pay increase at work. I'm okay with barely getting by. God, I want what you promised me. Are you serious? I've got to climb mountains. You know what? Being where I'm at isn't so bad. I'm comfortable. Historians now believe that only 20% of the Israelites living in Egypt left and followed Moses, meaning that 80% continued to sit in their comfort. They had received their promise just like the others. They had seen the plagues. They had experienced God's mercy, but yet they chose to stay because it was comfortable. They had simply reclined in denial. To them, it was just too hard. It was too far. It took too long. Tonight, I want to tell you that in order to reach your Jordan, the promise that God has for you, there are going to be times of desert. There are going to be times of mountains. There are going to be times where God just wants you to listen, just to sit and listen to what He wants for you to do, to instruct you to do. You see, the reason God didn't let the Israelites go the easy way was because God knew that they would turn around and they would immediately go back to Egypt. You see, as our verse in Ecclesiastes said, there is a purpose for every season that we go through. And tonight, I wanted to give an encouragement to every single person that is sitting here in the middle, waiting for their promise. They're waiting to cross the Jordan. Guess what? Your time is coming. After the Israelites entered the promised land, you see, we never hear again that they want to go back to Egypt. And that happens because of one thing. It was because the mountains and the deserts that they had to face. It was the mountains that they had to climb. Because when they were finally entering into the promised land, when they were finally entering the Jordan, when they looked back, all they could see is what that God had brought them through. They had seen those mountains that they had climbed, each and every single one of them. You see, one day you're going to look at your mountains that you faced and climbed and totally forget why you were lounging in Egypt to begin with. You see, all of you are just going to see your victory. If you stand with me tonight. Maybe you've been struggling. Maybe you can say, Pastor David, I feel you. I'm stuck. I'm stuck in the desert. I'm stuck in climbing these mountains. I've climbed some mountains. And about halfway, I can tell you I don't want to be climbing anymore. And I've experienced being on a mountain when it's thundering and pouring down rain. You definitely don't want to be on a mountain when that happens. But maybe you're hearing you say, hey, I'm experiencing this. That I've been waiting on a promise for so long that it seems like I just want to deny that I ever had a promise. That I'm okay with living in what I'm living in right now. I'm going to give you an opportunity to come and go and kneel at these altars. I want to give you encouragement that your promise is on the way. But you have to understand that there is a purpose for the deserts that you're facing, for the mountains that you're facing. Dear Lord, thank you for this wonderful lesson that you've taught us through the children of Israel. Of what happens in our process to gain our promise. That yes, you're going to call us through some deserts, that you are going to call us through some mountains, you're going to call us through times where you just want us to stand still and listen to what you have to say. Lord, I pray for each individual who feels stuck here tonight, in between the Jordan and denial. Lord, I pray that you encourage them. You speak to their hearts. Let them know that there is a purpose and that you haven't left them and you haven't forsaken them. That you haven't just put their promise and them on a shelf and to pull later on when it's time. That you are there every single step of the way. In your name we pray.